Good morning, sixth graders. We've finished up reading a lot of myths, the mythology that makes up sort of the way of seeing the world. In this case, it was mostly related to the Greek stories and the way in which they saw the world. In Greek mythology, somewhat coming, of course, over into Roman mythology, as the Romans had a way of adopting and incorporating and bringing in the mythology and the pantheon of gods, as it was known, from all the peoples they conquered. And they certainly thought this special way about the Greeks. In one sense, they always knew, as the Romans, they were more powerful than the Greeks. They had a more extensive empire, of course, and that way the Greeks were an afterthought eventually in terms of political power. But the Romans always treasured Greek art, culture, song, drama, and myth, that kind of thing. Well, we've seen how that has a sort of world-shaping effect, and there are elements in those myths that shape how someone sees the world, and especially in things that we can't normally perceive with our five senses, and help us sort of to react and to order ourselves in that way. Now, fairy tales do the same thing in a bit of a different way, okay, precisely because a fairy tale does not involve a notion of a deity, and it doesn't have those particular deities, right, who persist in all sorts of different stories. You know, Zeus in all kinds of different stories, Athena in all kinds of different stories, with a similar kind of characteristic throughout them and so forth. When we read a fairy tale, it's more often a one-off. That is a story we pick up, we meet the characters, we see how they interact with the world, and that's it. We see the conclusion of it, of course, we appreciate the characters, maybe we imitate them or not, but we don't see them persist throughout all of the stories, and there's not as much an idea that, you know, this particular character exists as a deity in my world or something like that. Instead, we learn from that particular character. You will be seeing that today in your reading of the Steadfast Tin Soldier. Okay, you will encounter the Tin Soldier, you'll encounter the other characters in this way. You'll see on your assignment page there are three questions, and I have even on the screen here in front of me written those out. You'll remember these three questions. What encounter with the magical begins the fairy tale? Do you remember when we went through the Princess and Curdie and the Princess and the Goblin? We talked a good bit at that time and took some notes about the nature of fantasy literature. And that what fantasy literature is trying to do is, in this sense, to create a world different from our own, but with some similarities to our own, so that we are in a different position to see some of those things about our world, which are always there. They have to be there. We don't deny their existence, but we can't see them or touch them or taste them or hear them, right? No one really denies that love is real. People definitely define it differently. They try and work it out differently. They might provide different examples or something like that. But everyone in this way believes that love is a thing. It exists. It's real, even though we can't hear it or see it or smell it or taste it or touch it, right? None of the five senses actually can capture love in that particular way. So that is what's going on in a piece of fantasy literature. Something similar is happening with mythology, with fairy tales as well. They are trying to show us real things about the world, but one of the things the fantasy or the fairy tale does is it puts it more in a situation where the senses can touch it, the senses can feel it, where there's some character who is representing love or something like that. Cupid, for example, so that we can interact with it in a different way, and then afterwards think about the concept, the reality of love differently as well. So you'll look at the Steadfast Tin Soldier. A short time ago, we looked at the fairy tale, The Little Match Girl, and so I'm going to interact just briefly with some of these questions in connection with The Little Match Girl. So you received a hard copy of that a good many weeks ago, back when we were meeting together physically on the campus at Veritas. And it says, what encounter with the magical begins this fairy tale? And I'm looking at the Little Match Girl. This will be a way just for me to give an example of how we're using these questions to understand the story. Now, you remember the Little Match Girl did not begin with the magical. It actually began very much in a kind of a difficult, tough, this world kind of experience. It was late on a bitterly cold New Year's Eve, it said. The snow was falling. A poor little girl was wandering in the dark, cold streets. She was bareheaded and barefoot. She had, of course, had slippers on when she left home, but they were not much good, for they were so huge. They'd also been worn by her mother, and they fell off the poor little girl's feet when she was running across the street to avoid two carriages that were rolling rapidly by. Oh, amazing imagery there, right? He shows us how poor she is, how she's kind of inherited these slippers from her mother, and if she's wearing her mother's slippers in this way, maybe she's lost her mother, right? Maybe her mother perished in some way, leaving behind these slippers, which were a possession of the family now. They couldn't buy her slippers that fit. At the same time, a carriage rolling by in this way that she had to flee. Well, I mean, that's just showing in some sense how the world is passing her by, how the world is ignoring her. In fact, it even shows how one of the slippers was picked up by a boy who ran off with it. She's having to walk on in her bare feet. Hans Christian Andersen, the author, then takes a moment to talk really about her beauty, how she's the picture of misery on the one hand, but also the snowflakes fell in her long yellow hair, which curled so prettily around her face. But she paid no attention to that. Lights were shining from every window, and there was a most delicious odor of roast goose in the streets, for it was New Year's Eve. So is he somehow saying that we wouldn't really be drawn to her in this way if she weren't beautiful? Not at all. But what he's doing is he's showing how the world treats her rather like she's meaningless, or like she's some kind of outcast, like she doesn't have worth. He uses, in fact, this idea then of the snowflake falling on her pretty hair to draw us in and make us see the true beauty of her. To use this kind of image of beauty on the outside of her to point us to the beauty on the inside of her. Because after all, if we really think about it in a way, is she probably in a situation where she's been able to keep her hair nicely, or is it probably matted a little bit from sleeping? Was she able to shower and shampoo? Probably not. And so actually, what he does is he helps put the perception in us, and he knows kind of the weakness of human beings, that sadly, if something is not good on the outside, we tend not to think of it as good on the inside. He puts that perception in us, which takes us all the way in. And we do feel empathy. We do feel love for her. We do see her as one of God's precious creatures who is now in this horrible situation, not being treated well by the world, not receiving the world's mercy, even as she has clearly been given a terribly difficult circumstance in life, as she's out in the cold trying to sell matches. Well, of course, what happens? She ends up feeling so cold as she kind of gets down into a little corner, hoping that these couple of buildings will break the wind a little bit. She strikes a match just to try and warm herself just a little bit. It says how it sputtered and blazed. It burnt with a bright, clear flame, just like a little candle, when she held her hand around it. Now the light seemed very strange to her. The little girl fancied that she was sitting in front of a big stove with polished brass feet and handles. There was a splendid fire blazing in it and warming her so beautifully. But what happened? Just as she was stretching out her feet to warm them, the flame went out, the stove vanished, and she was left sitting with the end of the burnt match in her hand. And so now, whether it is a real kind of hallucinating, which is maybe the way that if we were strictly thinking like a doctor or in medicine or something like that, in a scientific frame of mind, maybe we'd think about that she's hallucinating, or she's so moving on in that way that she's imagining things. Or if we were thinking more artistically, we would just think that her mind was now so full, that she had such an ability to focus on something that was good or sweet in life. It's like there's a sweetness coming out of her heart that matches her golden locks or something like that. No matter what the circumstance here, Hans Christian Andersen, do you see, is able to use these physical things to point us towards things we can't see. Love and comfort and all those kinds of things that are here coming her way. So she strikes another match, and it seems to her that this table is spread with a meal in front of her. The same thing happens again as it passes away. She strikes another match, and it feels like she's taken into a warm room surrounded by family and a Christmas tree there in the corner. And eventually then she strikes a match and sees her grandmother. "Grandmother," cried the little creature, "oh, do take me with you. I know you will vanish when the match goes out. You will vanish like the warm stove, the delicious goose, and the beautiful Christmas tree." She hastily struck a whole bundle of matches because she did so long to keep her grandmother with her. The light of the matches made it bright as day. Grandmother had never before looked so big or so beautiful. She lifted the little girl up in her arms, and they soared in a halo of light and joy far, far above the earth, where there was no more cold, no hunger, and no pain, for they were with God. In the cold morning light, the little girl sat there in only, whoops, I'm almost looking at the wrong page, in only the corner between the houses, with rosy cheeks and a smile on her face, dead. Frozen to death on the last night of the old year. New Year's Day broke on the little body, still sitting with the ends of the burnt-out matches in her hand. She must have died trying to warm herself, they said. Nobody knew what beautiful visions she had seen, nor in what a halo she had entered with her grandmother upon the glories of the new year. A couple of things here, just a precious, deep, and emotional story. Did you see how even once we see that she actually is moving toward death, the visions take on a bit of a different thought to us? Were they actually in some sense real? Like almost like as she was moving towards heaven in this way, like she was actually partially getting visions of it instead of some kind of scientific medical hallucination or something like that. We don't exactly know. Hans Christian Andersen's not going to answer that question entirely for us, but it seems so, perhaps. He's going to leave that out there for us to consider. Also, when he said Grandma was never more bigger nor more beautiful, in that sense, it's similar to how C.S. Lewis will describe heaven. Like things are in one sense the same. We have our true identity, but just grander, more, bigger, more beautiful, more full. He even describes at one point he describes the grass as more grassy, the sky as more blue, or something, those kinds of ideas. Well, Grandma was bigger. She was more beautiful in that way. They soared into a halo of light and joy, and we can see now why he chose the word halo. Now, here at the end, there's somewhat of the message that the living should be more merciful, right? There's somewhat of a Good Samaritan message there, and we don't want to ignore that. And yet, we almost can imagine that the whole message should be that, right? I'm sure a lot of us are ready to think of it just along those Good Samaritan lines. We living people, we who have some health or ability or money, that kind of thing, should help the poor. Of course, that's a very true message. And yet, Hans Christian Andersen didn't actually focus on that. Do you see our fairy tale questions? The first one is, what encounter with the magical begins this fairy tale? The first encounter of that magical is not so much like with magic, like hocus pocus of the dark arts, but it's more just the supernatural, where she begins to see these pleasures, these joys of heaven sort of coming out from the vision to her or towards her, which at first we can't really identify as heaven reaching out towards her. That is the unexpected turn. You see the question number 2, where is the unexpected turn? What purpose does it serve? And the unexpected turn is the way in which she starts to have these kinds of pleasures and joys, and they really seem to affect her, but then we realize it's because she's dying. That's the unexpected turn. The purpose it serves is to make us realize that in the real world, right, the world of the supernatural realm that God's created, as well as the natural realm that God's created, in the real world, death might not always be what it seems. Life may not always be what it seems. Life's pains can be overwhelmed by death's pleasures in the same way death's pains, in the same way life's pleasures could then be overwhelmed by death's pains, do you see? So how does it make the ending happy, even if it is also sad? Fairy tales often mix that, and of course it is sad, because this little girl had died in the real world, right? As we see it. There were real people who came the next morning. But it's also happy. Do you see how it said she died on the last day of the old year? And even when it says that the morning of the new year shone on her little dead body, part of his point is that she's no longer feeling the pain of that body or in that body as she's gone on to heaven in this way, just like her grandmother did. There's a happiness in thinking, she saw all these visions, right? That is where he actually ends the story. So there's a little bit of that Good Samaritan. But on the other hand, he's actually focusing on the fact that as she was dying, they didn't know what beautiful visions she had seen, nor in what a halo she had entered with her grandma upon the glories of the new year. And his idea here is kind of like, it's a never-ending new year. It's a new year which is always new in heaven. So J.R.R. Tolkien, he was a Christian writer of these kinds of stories, most famous for the Lord of the Rings books that he wrote, which then were made into movies. He says that these kind of fairy tales make us clean our windows, right? Like a windshield that needs those windshield wipers. to see things as they were meant to be seen. And what window does this story clean? What perception has changed? What lost thing is recovered? Well, the window that's clean here is somewhat the obvious about life and death. And that is that this life is not all there is. And that actually we need to be able to see correctly rewards in the life to come, the supernatural and the way it breaks into the real world now. That does not diminish the responsibility even of these people to feel the pain and conviction of the fact that they were not paying attention to this little girl, that they were not helping this little girl. That doesn't change the fact that they, in that sense, were doing wrong. But Hans Christian Andersen also wants to focus us on the fact, don't weep forever for her, because she has received glories and joys that we can't even yet imagine. But he's helping us to imagine it. He's helping us to see it. That's the way he's helping us clean our windows so that we will actually use that truth in our real lives. So that is a quick little walkthrough again of some of these special elements of the fairy tale. You now can look at the steadfast tin soldier and answer these same questions.